Greetings, class, and welcome to our new unit, the Animal Kingdom. In this unit, we'll be learning about the characteristics of the animal kingdom, as well as also be learning about the invertebrates. And then our final unit will concentrate on the highest order animals with the vertebrates. So let's start at the beginning. What does it mean to be an animal? First of all, animals are multicellular heterotrophic eukaryotes. They have no cell walls around their cells. They require oxygen for aerobic respiration. The vast majority reproduce sexually, but some can reproduce asexually by, for example, budding. They're motile at some stage of their lives, although some will become sessile, which means they won't move, like, for example, the sponge as an adult. Your higher order animals feature 4 distinct different types of tissues. Remember, in case you forgot from the very beginning of the year, organisms have their structure organized like this: cells. Groups of cells working together form tissues. Groups of tissues form organs. Groups of organs form organ systems. In the case of the animal kingdom, your higher order animals especially will exhibit these 4 different types of tissues. Epithelial tissues, which are those that cover the surfaces of the organism, for example, skin. Muscular tissue, which is specialized and developed for contracting. Nervous tissue, which is specifically designed to carry sensory information, and then connective tissue, like, for example, your blood and your bones. Depending on the complexity of the animal will determine how many layers of tissue they have. And not all animals have tissue, and not all animals exhibit all 4 types. In animals, you'll find, especially in your higher order animals, not necessarily your lower order animals, you'll find 3 distinct cell layers. You have the endoderm, which is a combination of 2 words, endo and derm, which basically is the inner cell layer, which will develop into the lining of your digestive tract. The mesoderm, which is like the middle layer, which contains your muscle and bone. And then the outer cell layer is your ectoderm, which develops into the skin, nerves, and senses. The structure you see in the image below is called the blastula. This is a young developing animal embryo. And you can see highlighted here the different layers of tissue as they develop, especially in this last image here. Make sure you look this slide over carefully in preparation for the test. All animals will exhibit symmetry with the exception of one organism, that's the sponge. The sponge is asymmetrical, which means it lacks symmetry. But all other animals will exhibit some type of symmetry, whether it's radial symmetry or bilateral. The more complex the organism, you will move from radial symmetry to bilateral symmetry. Radially symmetrical organisms are found in the water. They need to be in the water because they need help moving around, because they have a top and a bottom, but they have no left and right, and they have no front and back. But you can divide them in half multiple ways through a central point and end up with 2 identical sides. Bilaterally symmetrical organisms, like this human here, have only 1 line of symmetry. These are your most advanced organisms, and they also feature a head structure. That's something called cephalization, which we'll look at in a couple slides. But try to divide this sponge in half. There's no way to get 2 identical sides. That's why it's asymmetrical. Here's 2 examples. Here, the sea anemone, you can see here very clearly has multiple lines of symmetry, whereas the crayfish has only 1 line of symmetry. You can also see the concentration of sensory organs here at the head end, the compound eyes, the antennules, and the antennae. This is something called cephalization, which you see in the higher order animals. You can also see, since it's bilaterally symmetrical, the 4 orientations. They have the anterior or front end, posterior or back end, dorsal side, which is the top, and ventral side, which is the bottom. Remember those terms from when we do our dissection so you can orientate your organism properly on the tray. As animals become more complex, as we move through the unit, you're going to see some trends developing, which is very interesting. First, the organisms will become predominantly bilateral, with the exception of the echinoderms. The number of tissue layers, like we looked at in a couple slides ago, will become increasing. The development of a coelom, which appears with the worms, which basically is an open body cavity where the organs can be stored, sexual organs can be stored, room for live birth and internal fertilization. All that develops because of that body cavity. One-way digestive tract, in which there's 2 openings, a mouth and an anus. It's not necessarily common to all animals. Some of your lower order animals have a two-way digestive system, which the mouth is basically the anus. There's one opening for food to come in and food to go out. You'll see segmentation develop with distinct body sections in the organisms, and cephalization, which is the development of the head with sensory organs like you saw in the crayfish. As we move through the unit, we're basically going to follow the cladogram here. We'll start first looking at the sponges all the way on this side here. One of them, about the only few things they share with the animal kingdom is the fact that they're multicellular heterotrophic eukaryotes. They don't have tissues. They don't have the 3 different germ layers we looked at in the previous slides. They don't have any type of symmetry. As we start to move along, you'll see tissues develop with the cnidarians, but they don't have the distinct germ layers. They only have 2 layers of tissue. They have radial symmetry, so they branch off here. Then we get into some of the most important groups of organisms, the worms. Many of the distinct and important and significant adaptations of the animal kingdom first appear with these guys, actually. These organisms moving forward here exhibit protostome development, which means first mouth. These organisms, their blastula, as the embryo is developing, the first opening will become the mouth. The roundworms, significant, as you'll see in a few slides, because this is where we first see the one-way digestive system. They have a pseudocoelom, not a true coelom, that develops a little bit later here. We'll see that with the earthworm. We do that dissection. Then we move along here. You can see the organisms are becoming primarily bilaterally symmetrical, with the exception of the echinoderms, which are still very advanced organisms. At this point, the blastula is a little bit different. These guys are deuterostomes, which means second mouth. The second opening becomes the mouth, and this is one of the characteristics that we share in common with the echinoderms and the chordates, which makes us kind of almost like distant cousins, which we'll be looking at in the next unit. Now let's look at the lower order animals today and the invertebrates to finish out this first part of the unit. First we'll look at the sponges. The sponges belong to the phylum Porifera, which means pore-bearing, because their bodies are covered with pores. They have no body symmetry. They have no tissues or organs. They reproduce sexually and asexually through budding. Their larval stage can swim, but they do become sessile as adults. They're filter feeders, and they feed by something called intracellular digestion, in which the digestion actually takes place within the cells, unlike higher order animals we'll look at later, which takes place within developed tissues and organs. Some important structures that you would find in a typical sponge, and we're not going to spend too much time on them, is the osculum, the amoebocytes, where food is broken down and digested, the choanocytes, which beat with their flagella to move the water through the body of the sponge, because remember they're filter feeders, and the spicules, which are kind of spiky structures which protect the sponge and provide support for it, almost like a rudimentary skeleton, if you will. You see those structures on this slide here. You can see the flagella here, which would beat, like in these images here, creating the current for the water to move through the pores into the body of the sponge, where the amoeboid cells would capture the food particles and digest them. The water would move up through the osculum and out. Here's some examples of some sponges. Of course, you can see the osculum here, the most famous sponge of all, SpongeBob, the only bilaterally symmetrical sponge. Sponges are important because they provide habitats for animals, they live in mutualistic relationships with other organisms, and they're filter feeders, so they help keep the water clean in the surrounding areas that they're in. Great to have in a saltwater fish tank at home. Next group we'll look at are the cnidarians. This phylum contains organisms with stinging cells. That's what their name literally means, stinging. These guys are the first organisms that we look at that have symmetry. They're radially symmetrical, which means they're found in the water. They have structures called nematocysts and cnidocytes, which are the stinging cells, which are kind of unique to this group. Sting their prey, stun them so then they can capture and eat them. They have 2 tissue layers, not like the higher order animals, which have 3, but they do have an epidermis and a gastrodermis with a layer of jelly in between called mesoglia. They have a very, very rudimentary nervous structure, and they still exhibit intracellular digestion. Here's some examples: the man of war, coral, sea anemones, jellyfish, all examples in cnidarians. There are 2 different body plans that you'll find exhibited in the cnidarians. You have the medusa, which kind of looks like an umbrella, and the tentacles hang down and face down, and then the mouth is right here. And then you have the polyp body plan where the tentacles are upward and the mouth is located here. A lot of times, but not 100% of the time, but a lot of times your polyps will be sessile and your medusae will move around in the water. Some organisms, like this jellyfish in the next, actually exhibit both within one life cycle. So at this particular point, I'd like to stop right here. And then in part 2, we'll move into higher order animals within the invertebrates, starting, of course, with one of the most significant groups, which are the worms.